Hi and welcome to Mavericks. You know that we invite CEOs and business leaders to take us through their wisdom, their work and life so that our participants can understand what they need to do in their work life. Today, however, we have a special guest, someone who will get us to understand how to work within the environment of our business landscape as well as political and geopolitical landscape. We have with us Talal Rafi, an economist, a regular columnist for the IMF, an expert member at the World Economic Forum, a visiting lecturer at the central bank, and a good friend with us today. So Talal, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, Roshan, for having me.
It was lovely to have you because we're going through such turmoil. We have brain drain, we have worker discouraged, we're wondering about whether this will work or not. And as a coach, when I go through my work, and this week is International Coaching Week, we find that many would come and ask, yes, I'd like to be coached, but I have some problems that's working in my mind. Will this work for us? Will the business environment change? So on and so forth. So let me ask you the typical American question, which is, what is the state of our economy right now?
Right. Thanks for having me. That's a good question. So the truth is we are at a sort of a crossroad. The economy, of course, when you compare it to 2022, we are in a much better shape. But there is also a sort of a misunderstanding about the IMF program as well. The IMF program, as far as everyone's concerned, or the IMF itself, according to their mandate, is to bring Sri Lanka, bring stability to the economy. So I think we have achieved it. If you look at what's going on, the inflation, I mean, it was at around 70%, which is extremely high. We could have gone into hyperinflation. You know, we could have experienced what Zimbabwe went through. That could have been havoc. But we've managed to bring it into single digits and almost touching zero. So our reserves are getting built. The interest rates have come down, and it could come down even further. So we've reached a bit of stability. I think the path we need to move on to is growth. So that is absolutely essential, and that's where we need to make the turn. So currently, as you know, our debt to GDP was at around 128%. And even the IMF program, sorry to sound so gloomy, even if we do everything right, and according to the IMF program, by 2032, we are aiming to bring debt to GDP down to 95%. So let's, Ghana defaulted when its debt to GDP was only at 93%, around 93%. So even if we do things rightly, we could be into a position just slightly worse than where Ghana was. So that's where our path is. So, but we rapidly need to move into a growth momentum. So there are ways to do that. I think Sri Lanka is at a time where we need to switch gears. But also talking, this is also a critical time because we are also going through an election, and some of the manifestos by parties we could be looking at a crossroad where we could try out methods that have been tried in the past, failed, or a new path. So a lot depends on the elections as well.
Well, that's very interesting because many businesses question whether it is worthwhile working within Sri Lanka or situating their businesses outside. Many employees are wondering whether they will find better prospects elsewhere. Any thoughts on that?
So this situation, I mean, there's a bit of unpredictability, especially with elections and the direction in which we are going. But in the, if I am to be very optimistic, there are countries which have turned around. Like, for example, look at India. In 91, since independence, for 4 decades, India was under, what you call the license Raj. So it was over-regulated, sort of like not much investments were allowed into the country. There was less of trade. And then Dr. Manmohan Singh, as finance minister, transformed India. And now it's the best performing or the fastest growing G20 economy in the world, and growing at around 7 to 8%. So, herein, I think for many people, when you go abroad, I say this to myself as well, there you have a saturated market. There, the opportunities to grow are much less. But here, when the economy kicks off, there is a lot of positive prospects for high growth here. Especially the reason I say this is because the reason for us to grow is not just for us to come out of debt, because there are countries, powerful countries, who have also lent to Sri Lanka. So it is also in their interest for us to grow out of this crisis.
Right.
So there will be external support as well. So in that instance, like I would always encourage people to give hope, have hope in this country, because we are a very resilient nation. So we have come out of many crises. So finished a war, came back, then we had a tsunami. A lot of instances, one thing Sri Lanka is always known for is resilience. So even if you look at Sri Lankans who go abroad, we have people who have achieved a lot. There is a Sri Lankan who was one of the people instrumental in co-founding Facebook. Then you have a Sri Lankan, Dr. Shanta Devarajan, who became the chief economist of the World Bank. So there are people who perform. So the human capital in this nation is very good, excellent. So it's just how I would describe this country is that it's a country, it's a car which can travel very fast. It's just that we have too many brakes. So too much of regulations, things which don't allow businesses to function. Ease of doing business, that's an issue. Trade, that's another issue. So thing that I keep repeating is that for us to become an export-oriented economy, we need to look at an outward-oriented policy. We are too inward-looking. Like, for example, 70% of global trade is supplying global value chains. For that, you need to be able to import as well as export. So, more free trade agreements, like look at Vietnam. They expanded because they allowed free trade.
Yeah.
Most of their companies are able to import as well as export. So, that is where the growth should be. But coming back to your question, I think there is hope for this country. And also, another point, Niroshan, I want to remind Sri Lankans of. There is a talk that, for 7 decades, this country has been put down, this country has been destroyed by past politicians. So, the opportunity cost, of course, is great. But let's not forget that in South Asia, Sri Lanka is still the richest country GDP per capita. A Sri Lankan is still richer than an Indian. He is still richer than a Bangladeshi. He is still richer than a Pakistani. So with the exception of Maldives, we still have the highest GDP per capita in South Asia.
Okay.
So even though we are bankrupt, we are still the richest nation, with the exception of Maldives, which we can dismiss it as a very small country. But when you look at larger countries, I mean, we are still better than Nepal in GDP per capita terms, then Bangladesh, then Pakistan, and even India. So this country is not as gloomy as some might say. Of course, opportunity cost is high. I agree with that. We should have been a much developed country. There were a lot of opportunities that were lost when a large number of nations were signing free trade agreements, getting companies in. We lost the opportunity. I mean, a good example is when President J.R. Jayawardena was there. There was this thing about Motorola coming in. But that was when the war started and they pulled out. Countries transform because of just one company. If you look at Costa Rica, Intel coming in was just one company coming in, which sort of changed the perception, brought in investors, brought in other companies. Everybody was like, Intel is coming, so why not us go? Vietnam transformed because of one company, Samsung. So they came in, they set up. So when a company such as Samsung sets up, the local companies are, there is a lot of technology transfer, management skill transfer. And local suppliers, rise up to the occasion to supply company like Samsung. And even if Samsung pulls out, these people have learned something, they start their own manufacturing. So there is a base. Look at Tamil Nadu, like it attracts now. Apple sort of,
Yes.
there is a plan for them to move in a big way as well. So it's like when you succeed in one thing, it attracts a
Yeah.
large number of investors. So investment is the way forward,
Yeah.
in my opinion.
Grass is always greener on the other side. So when we travel and work in different parts of the world, they too talk about their hardships and how the best talent is moving out of their countries. Sometimes you can't come up with the equation, because if they're also leaving and we are also leaving, where are these people going? So global geopolitical situation is also not very stable right now. We're probably having about 2-3 major wars on its horizon. In On this kind of a backdrop,
Right.
the type of development you're talking about, is it harder for us? What are your thoughts on that?
So definitely, as I said before, many times countries get into trouble, like how Sri Lanka did in 2022. But that's when our friends are in a better position. But right now, unfortunately, our friends such as the US or Japan, they're also, there is a sort of a global downturn. Economic growth isn't that strong. And we are also in a time when, according to the UN, 54 other nations are also showing signs of debt stress. It also included at that time when we defaulted large countries such as Egypt, Pakistan. So it's also unfortunate that we went down in a sort of a period where things were not going well for others as well, who could have better helped us in that instance. So those factors play a role.
While I'm so encouraged to ask questions of economics, I also read about you and I found out that you've been a consultant on entrepreneurship. And that's an area which is very much within your repertoire. How does the entrepreneur play his or her role in this kind of a backdrop?
So yes, I have worked for USAID project and others on entrepreneurship, but and I myself was an entrepreneur at the beginning. So I mean, it is a tough environment to be an entrepreneur. I mean, there's so much of challenges coming your way, interest rates high, so and also trying to get investments is also tough in this environment. And a lot of companies, we hear that they are moving their head offices to Singapore and other nations. But what we also find is that during these downturns, there are opportunities. Like for example, if you look at 2009, during the financial crisis, that gave birth to companies such as Uber, Airbnb. So when there is sort of innovation, there is an innovative mind, and when you have a government that is more conducive to helping you out, there can be a lot of opportunities as well. But it's a tough environment. It's not really. You might be encouraged a lot to just take a job and wait till the environment improves. But it's always a tough call to make. But as far as entrepreneurship goes, I think the government needs to focus a lot on that. Because also being a management consultant with Deloitte in the past, we usually break down problems. So if you look at, for us, we definitely need the private sector to grow out of this country. I mean, the public sector is, there is nothing more to expand. We have around 1.5 million people working for the public sector, which is a huge amount. So the private sector has to really, so there are two ways for the private sector to grow. One is for existing businesses to expand, or for new businesses to come up. And another fact is that if you look at South Asia, we have one of the lowest entrepreneur to population ratios in the region. Some estimates put it at around 2% or below. So it's much larger in other nations like Thailand, Vietnam. So this is also something that we need to encourage entrepreneurs. So India, in the last 10 years, has been sort of like putting up programs to encourage, so shifting the sort of mindset towards becoming an entrepreneurship. Because here, even when people are in school, they report that you're always encouraged to, do well, get good results, get a job, move on. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. Some people, entrepreneurship is not for everyone. I mean, I have worked with the World Economic Forum, with the Asian Development Bank, been on their jury panels, all that. When you find that it's something like, people say, what do you need to be a successful entrepreneur? So by studying, I would clearly say that it's definitely the number one quality is not being smart. If you're smart, you'll find yourself working at Goldman Sachs or the World Bank or McKinsey. So what you need is the risk taker, the person who will take the risk. So that you find it like 1 in 100. So when those people click, you can get the right people. They are the ones who really come up. Because creating an entrepreneur is also reducing a job seeker. You're creating a job creator. So for this country, like, you see very successful entrepreneurs here, like you were interviewing Mr. Ashraf Omar or Mr. Damika Pereira. So when they become entrepreneurs, they create thousands of jobs. So this is the way we need. We need more of those things. I mean, another thing I have said this in the past interviews as well. A lot of people talk about getting rid of poverty. So how this thing is like, giving handouts to the poor or encouraging, that is, of course, even the IMF program stipulates a 0.6% of GDP, and I'm all for it. But in the long term, you can't keep doing that. What we need to do is economic growth. So South Korea eliminated poverty just simply by growing. They just grew at 7% for decades and decades, and they eliminated it by becoming richer. So of course, the trickle down effect, but at the same time, of course, inequality is going to be there. Like if you look at developed countries, the richest person or the richest 1% and the poorest 50%, I mean, there's a huge divide. But still, the poorest are way better off than in a developing country. So look at India or other countries where they had socialist policies. I mean, they're still struggling, a vast majority of them. So it's just that after 91, because of the transformation, that a large amount of people have been pushed into the middle class. So countries such as India, China, these are examples of how moving away from socialist policies towards an environment which encourages investments, opens up trade, lets I mean, in any country, even in a family of 5, let's say, there is going to be a couple of them who don't do much work. There'll be one who will be extremely focused and get. So the answer is not to level the playing field and ask everyone to be equal. It's just incentivizing. Like if one of the 5 sons wants to do well, let him do well. If the other 2 won't, of course, we can take some from the successful one and give it to the other 2 who don't want to work that much. But like trying to level the playing field and saying, no, all of you all have to be equal, I mean, that doesn't work.
Doesn't work. If I were to ask a very generic question and not from a subject matter point of view, how does an individual get that resilience to wake up? What I mean is, when I talk to youngsters all over the country, some of them will say, look, I'm looking for a government job because it's easy to do. I may get a pension. I can go off at 3:30. I don't know whether they do or not. And they're looking at the easy life at a very tender age. That energy within, why are we losing that?
So as I mentioned, there are 2 options in life as far as I'm concerned. One is, like you mentioned, the easy option, being the average person. You can get a good job, send your children to an average school, not take much risks. So that is nothing wrong with that. You be average. You don't go to the bottom, neither do you go to the top. But then there is the other path where you take risks. So risk is there is of course there is a risk that you can even lose what you currently have. I mean, many people who come up mortgage their own houses to get a loan to do a business. Some succeed, some lose their house, are even in a worse position. But the thing is, it's about what could motivate them the best, in my opinion, is regret. Just a question to the youth: do you want to be at the age of 80 sitting and then thinking that I could have done this, I could have done that, I would have been like this, I could have lived my dream? Or, I mean, that's what people tend to, or in my opinion, people should be most afraid of. Regret is something that's, you have the opportunities. If you really want to, that's what should drive you, in my opinion.
conversations and meaningful conversations, whether that's a parent-child, a teacher-parent, a business leader, a national leader. Some are good at the gift of the gab and they will talk 1,000 to the dozen, but you somehow at the end of the day feel this is not going to work out. We are very poor in our conversation with our people, whether as a nation or as a parent, the smallest being parent, nation being the largest. Is it the way that we've been carved through the colonial way of doing things, or is it that we've just become this, or is it post-COVID that this has happened to us? What are your thoughts on this?
So, if you're talking about the way we are, the expression, I think it's also got to do with the education system because I play a role in that also. So, I serve on the Enterprise Operations Committee at Morotua University. So, what we find is there is a sort of a difference between sort of the Western universities. One interesting thing is that I wrote a piece for the IMF on this, which was voted as the most read one of the most read articles in 2022, where there is a sort of a direct thing between innovation and economic growth. So, in order to grow, for example, look at Sri Lanka, it's an aging population. So, for us to grow, either our population should grow or our resources should grow. Suddenly, like you find oil and you become rich, which unfortunately we don't have. Or the third thing is like we increase our productivity, the efficiency of a person. Yeah. So, innovate. So, here again coming back to the thing, we have an education system that doesn't encourage people to sort of talk. Because when you look at it, it's always rote based learning. The teacher tells, you listen to it, you follow through, yeah, memorize it, and then you put it. And then at the end, like you get the highest results in A-levels. I'm not putting anybody down, but it's more like what you have memorized from the textbooks rather than solving a real problem. Solving a real problem, it's like mostly engineering students. So there it's also a reason why engineers are very successful. I started off as an engineering student and then I moved on. So there are arguments in that way. So rote-based learning, that is something that we need to move away from, because we need a culture where people are encouraged to talk. Because here in school, if you ask too many questions, you're told to just shut up and sit down. Don't talk too much. The teacher knows best. We are your parents, we know better. So this sort of thing doesn't encourage people to speak out what they want, try out what could be innovative. So herein lies the problem. We need a culture. Speaking about that, Silicon Valley. So it's the most successful entrepreneurship ecosystem in the world. So there are many countries from Russia who have sent teams to study that, brought it back to their countries, many other countries. It never worked, because it can never work, because in Silicon Valley, you can think whatever you want. That culture, and it's okay to fail. It's okay to say things. You're not shy anymore. So that kind of culture, you can take everything away. You can bring the venture capitalists, the angel investors, the environment, the regulations, the money. I mean, Dubai, they have all the money, but you can never become Silicon Valley, because the free mind. That's think about democracy. Sorry, I'm jumping from topic to topic. Just one thing I would like to state, because there was always a thing about even a few days ago somebody was saying, is democracy a hindrance to economic growth? So I was saying, if you study countries other than a few oil states or city states, every other advanced economy in the world is a democracy. So even South Korea and Taiwan, they transitioned from a middle income to an advanced economy, because at that correct time they became democracies. Because you can take a lot of people from the agricultural sector, put them into factories and grow like how China did. But in order to transition from a middle income country like how Sri Lanka is to an advanced country, you need to be able to innovate. You need the government has to give the business people the freedom to make decisions. So democracy, as far as I'm concerned, is very essential if we are to move as a developed nation. We have to have the institutions in place, but also free thinking for people to try out what they want.
Yeah. And from a management coaching point of view, dealing with the younger generations, Gen Zs, and considering the fact that we're talking about AI and technology and all of that boom, without that free thinking, ability to understand, absence of conversation, we won't have that future closer to where we work, because they will fly away.
Yes.
And dealing with Gen Zs, everybody, the older generation would say they're different, or they're difficult rather, they will say. I would like to say they're different. In your travels, and you've come across different age gaps, different types of people with different thinking, how do they manage the younger workforce?
So it's a bit of a challenge, because what you find is the older generation. I mean, they come from a different environment. I myself am a millennial, so it's like, but I wouldn't be too harsh on them, because one thing is that the environment was different. Like if you look at those days, people could easily afford a house, a car. But we are in an environment like, even if you have to be at a very high position in a good company to afford even basic things that our parents could have got easily. So they are coming into an environment that's quite stressful. But at the same time, it's also a sort of a different, I mean, you're born into a culture where, it's normal to be around the phone. So everything you want is instant, so instant gratification.
Yeah.
You want a movie, like those days you don't have to go to a shop or borrow a DVD or a video cassette. You have it on Netflix. Food within 30 minutes you order on Uber. So everything, so there is a sort of a different thinking as well. So that comes to the question that I think this generation could also be sort of a, if it can be used in a correct way, to bring out the best of ideas as well. I mean, we come in the environment has changed. I mean, most of the repetitive jobs are being taken over by automation, AI, robots, manufacturing jobs being taken over. So the one thing that AI cannot take over, at least in the coming decades, is creativity, critical thinking. So those are the areas I feel that the Gen Z and the coming generations can play a greater role. Because whatever said, nowadays we have a lot of information. There is no sort of need to memorize, know things. It's just about the coming decades is going to be about how the human mind can use the information that is available to make things better for us. So some are predicting that most jobs will be gone, but that is something that we humans have to work on.
I think, old as I am, the last time I heard this was when an organization shut down their typewriter division and opened their computer division, where 50 people were given the tools. They were given the physical tools, and they were laid off, and they were told, make up your own job and sort yourself out, of which only 4 people actually decided to stay back and learn computing from scratch. They all moved away, and everybody said, with the computers, everything, all the jobs will change. I think it has increased the number of jobs, not necessarily reduced. So these are all things that we've seen repetitively, and little ghosts that come up. It's what we will do with it that matters. Now, what's interesting is, while we are having a conversation about young people, entrepreneurship and development, you would have in these developing nations, not all of them, leaders of countries who are not equipped, educated, or don't have the bandwidth to understand this. And when I see a Prime Minister of Singapore, where they've taken such a long time to choose the right candidate, or when I see an old lady who's the finance minister, and I'm not saying old lady in a derogatory way, but in a way that I would not have thought of how eloquent she was discussing cryptocurrency at Parliament. Do we have that bandwidth within our leadership in the country, generically?
Generically, I think the whole idea about selecting leaders is wrong in this country, I believe. Because if you look at the way people vote, it's usually, even right now in this crisis, it's mostly like, there is this one leader, he will lead us. I mean, there is no, I've said this, I mean, it's always comes to policies. You have to have the correct policies, no matter what the personality of the person is. I mean, you can have Lee Kuan Yew coming to Sri Lanka, we can elect him as the leader of Sri Lanka, but if he uh, follows outdated policies, of course Sri Lanka is going to get bankrupt anyway. So it's not the personality. Like a good example is Dr. Manmohan Singh. Like he is somebody who is more of a very quiet person who is very unlikely to win an election in Sri Lanka or anything. But he was the one who was courageous enough to transform the economy of India. That's no easy task, like transforming an economy of nearly 1 billion people. So he was the one who made the changes. So it's not about personality. Even if you look at China, Deng Xiaoping, the person who primarily behind China's economic transformation, people describe him as a very quiet sort of, not a very charismatic person. So therein you find the leaders who are who have the skills. But here in Sri Lanka, what is found is that, you know, people tend to think that leaders who are very charismatic, or I mean, I'm not saying no. I mean, you can be a charismatic leader and you can change the nation. But what I would advise, especially since we are going into a presidential elections, is always choose a leader with the correct policies. It's not just one leader. We have a system where, let's say I become president. I mean, you still have a parliament of 225 and you have to have 113 or more of those MPs on your side to run a government. So I can't do anything. I mean, if I try to make changes and some of them cross over, my government falls. So it's not like a thing where you can do everything. So a lot of experience is also needed. You also need a team. You need a consensus, a mandate from the people to do the. So everything plays a role if we are going to. So coming to that question, there is I feel that nations such as Thailand made a change. They never went to the IMF. India, after 91, never went to the IMF. But Sri Lanka, I mean, we've become bankrupt, but still I don't feel we're going in the right direction because we haven't diagnosed the problem correctly. If you ask 9 out of 10 people what is the cause of the crisis, they say corruption. Yes, corruption is an issue. The IMF itself has given a diagnostic report. But if you look at Transparency International, Bangladesh and Indonesia more corrupt than us. I mean, they were growing at 6 to 7% while we were declaring bankruptcy. If you look at South Korea, it's an example of a country which went from almost a very poor to a advanced economy, and 4 of their past presidents are convicted of corruption. So corruption is not something that's easily able to eliminate it, and I feel that is one of the issues. I mean, if you look at, for example, Sri Lanka's expenditure, over 80%, if I'm not wrong, goes to recurrent expenditures like interest payments,
Yes.
salaries, pensions. So these are things which are untouched by corruption. I mean, there's nothing. Pensions, salaries go. I mean, only in the capital expenditure can you do anything. So it doesn't really amount to much, though I'm not belittling it. It is a cause, but I think if you look at the top 3 problems, corruption is definitely one of the top 3, and we have to focus heavily on solving it. But there are other issues as well. Like we're a very protected economy. That is one thing we need to liberalize. There is a lot of ease of doing business. We are 99th in the world. There are many other issues. We need land, for example. 82% of the land is owned by the government. So how can you develop when the private sector doesn't have access to land? Labor laws are outdated. So there are a lot of wider issues as well which have to be solved along with dealing with corruption, in my opinion, if we are to this thing. But in no way am I saying corruption is to be taken lightly. What I'm saying is, like, we need to focus on all issues. People have to understand that not just corruption, but there are other very, very important reforms that have to be taken for this country to come out.
Sure. In fact, it's interesting that I was working with a particular CEO who once said, I want processors to run this company, not heroes. And in the next 2 years, I will start relegating my powers, at which time it will be time for me to go. Company should not be run by heroes, but processors. So leaning on to the more corporate world from the economic and socio-economic world, Business leaders would probably have the same amount of major decisions because most often they are running the whole economy. From an organizational perspective to CEOs, what kind of advice, what kind of solace could you offer to the CEOs and the leaders of business in Sri Lanka?
Uh, to the leaders, I think an approach, especially being a management consultant for one of the big fours before, it's that I feel that we have advised it's good to get a consensus from everyone. So this is something that I have personally done as well. So one thing is, for example, if you look at many companies that have come out, some of them, an example is, forgot the name of the company. I mean, they had a shadow advisory board, which was put up with teenagers. No, not teenagers, I think around 18 to 20. Okay. So coming back to the thing about how Gen Z can help.
Yeah.
So that actually they were better able to understand what was going on and relate it back to the CEOs, which eventually went on to save their firms.
Okay.
So an advice is to have an open mind. That would be one thing I would say to many leaders. So you can understand, because if you look at the corporate lifespan of companies, it's come down very much. There is a lot of disruptive innovation. So you have to always, it's not like those days, you have a Coca-Cola or a McDonald's or even an IBM which could last for decades. Now, I mean, Facebook doesn't innovate for a few years. There could be a rival that could easily disrupt them. So what I say is you need to be open to understanding things. A good example is something that I have written for Forbes as well, to have younger people on your board. That sort of helps. Have more females on the board, because that sort of brings a wider perception into strategizing. Some even in the US, minorities. So diversity always helps, and it's shown that it has helped companies come out. Because even if you look at studies done even by Harvard and others, in the US it's mostly it's very old men who are serve on boards where the critical decisions on strategy are made. And coming back to that, I also feel like on corporate boards, you need to spend more time on strategy. That is something that's lacking, because it's mostly, some of the times I've studied on them as well, you find that a large amount of time is spent on operational things, but that is for the operation. The board is mostly for strategic decisions. So if a time can be allocated for those things, that would play a large role.
As they say, and I never thought I would use this word, in the good old days, they used to have an economist in the board, whether it was to talk about international economics or labor economics or econometrics or from a different perspective. How come many boards don't look at that anymore? Do you have any insight on that?
Yes, I mean that is also something that has been overlooked. I mean, after the crisis, I think it's picked up, but usually like economists are on boards of insurance companies or finance companies or banks. But yes, definitely, there has to be a move to bring more of them onto the boards, because now we live, this crisis has shown that you can make all the good decisions internally, but then look at how we are affected. If anybody could have foreseen it, they could have. So that is, of course, essential in my view, to increase the amount of exposure they get. Nowadays, I find a lot of boards inviting economists to give presentations and others. So these things can, of course, because like I mentioned, you can improve everything inside, but you also need somebody to foretell what's going to happen. I mean, apart from studying the consumer markets, your competitors, you also need somebody to help you understand what the wider plan of the country is, where the whole global economy is heading. Everything is, in a world where everything is interconnected. I mean, look at this, just Russia-Ukraine war, or interest rates coming up or down in the US, or deflation in, for example, China. These all affect Sri Lankan businesses.
Sure.
So decisions have to be tailor-made and changed according to things that happen outside our control.
If you don't mind, may I go back to the inclusion and diversity?
Sure.
And whether in a country in terms of lobbyist groups, whether it is in organizations of, let's say, board quotas, it is having a profound impact wherever we go. And yes, there are studies that say diversity supports decision making. Equally, there are plenty of studies that would say, well, it's not having one older type of people in a business like you were talking about, but most organizations now have different generations. But where you go into quota systems and all of that, and there's a lot of discussion, pluses and minuses. What are your thoughts on quotas and diversity? Because for me, it's not just gender. Diversity has so many different colors. Any thoughts on that, Talal?
So personally, in my opinion, I'm not a big fan of the quota system because one thing is we all have to come up through merit.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we also find that bringing somebody on the corporate board because of a quota belittles them as well. They are seen as a token or just brought in because of some government regulations, not taken very seriously. But at the same time, we have to admit that things are much tougher if you're a younger person or a female, or in like other countries in the US or something, if you're coming from a minority to get into a board. So there are variations in that, but as a whole, I think merit, but we need to improve the environment. So a very, for example, getting onto a board is not something that's advertised. It's usually done through networking at the highest level. So there again, how much of an opportunity is there for females to actually go? I mean, in a culture when most of the decisions are, men meet up late at night, over a drink, this thing. In our culture, it's quite difficult for a female to join those groups. So here again, that's where maybe a decision is made to bring someone onto a board.
Yeah.
So here again, we are against the quota system, we are for a merit, but how much is the exposure somebody gets? So that is also a sort of so it's quite a different argument, but some studies show that yes, some companies bring in a female, and then it's like there was a study that showed that you have to have at least 2 to 3 females to make it effective. Like usually you suddenly bring a female and then they are in a board with 9 very senior assertive men, and then she's a bit intimidated to talk, and then everybody says, I mean, we brought them, they don't do much. See, there's no point in females. I mean, this was put out in studies actually.
Sure.
So there are, so it's quite a difficult thing, but definitely I think that bringing people on to at the highest level in the corporate sector would be a game changer. And I've written about this for Forbes as well.
Yeah, positive discrimination. There's a lot of conversation. We can have that as a separate topic as well, because of femininity versus masculinity versus male versus female, and the conversation is very much rich. The last question probably I will ask you would be, from a nation that's going through all of this, and you spoke about resilience on the other side, if there was one thing that an individual needs to think about when they are thinking of their future and their life plan for the next 1 or 2 years, 1 or 2 things, it doesn't need to be one, what would they need to do? So individual thinking of their life plan for the next 1 or 2 years, what are the 2 most important factors that they should consider?
So one thing is, of course, what they can get is maybe one factor they need to look at is reskilling.
Okay.
That is definitely one idea. That is because I could have, if I had time, I'd have thought of a better answer. But at this moment, if I am put in a position, I would always think that upskilling, reskilling, that is definitely one area that we can focus on.
Absolutely.
But at the same time, also, where is the direction of the country going? That is also another interesting thing to look into.
A consultant to the ADB, a wonderful economist, a good friend. Talal, thank you so much for coming to our program. I'm sure the viewers will see a different light other than the business world we generally talk about with your interview. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me, Niroshan. It's an absolute pleasure to be on your show. Thank you.
Thank you.